What if one of the biggest threats to your independence isn't a disease, but likely something you've never heard of? It's called frailty. The good news? Experts say it is not an inevitable part of aging. People like Tracey are determined to prevent it.
Because I'm losing strength with perimenopause and I don't want to hurt myself if and when I fall. Leading up to going to the gym, yeah, I was feeling weak. I was feeling tired and weak, and the feeling the energy leaving my body. And now that I've started working out, I'm feeling myself gaining strength. I'm feeling myself being able to increase my weights. I'm feeling myself have to eat more to sustain the energy that I'm using. And I'm feeling less aches and pains.
Tracey does weights at the Unison at Kerby Center Fit Room. It's one of the things you can do to avoid frailty. But doctors who study aging say it's time we start focusing more on our abilities and not our deficits.
Frailty, even though people talk a lot about it, it's a little bit hard to sometimes precisely define. That one of the issues I have with frailty is a point you bring up, that it focuses, on deficits and it's kind of limited to more the physical side. Um, where I think with healthy aging, we have to be more holistic and look at, psychological attributes that you might miss with a pure perspective looking at physical frailty.
That's where intrinsic capacity comes in. In this story, we explore what it means and how we can improve it.
I lost some weight about 6 years ago, 5, 6 years ago, um, when I empty nested, and I had to find my purpose again after the kids moved out. I needed to reevaluate my whole life, and so I went through some big changes then, and gaining my physical health back was really important to me. Eating a lot of eggs, eating a lot of eggs. I cried over the cost of groceries though, and realizing that this is going to cost more. It's not just a gym membership, which is cheap here.
But it save you in the end, right?
Save me in the end. I want to be active and around. I didn't expect that I would be here at this age, to be honest. I didn't expect that I would make it to this stage of life. And now that I'm here, I'm starting to look at the next 10 years going, I might actually be here for the next 10, 20, 30 years. So surprisingly, no, I thought that I was going to be sore and I'm not. So that leads me to believe that I can probably increase the weight that I'm doing. I'm also cautious and trying not to hurt myself and overextend myself.
I'm Dr. David Hogan. I'm a retired physician, and my field of practice before I retired was geriatric medicine. I have a professor emeritus appointment at the University of Calgary.
And thanks for joining us today. Now, what exactly is frailty and is how different is it from simply just getting older?
Well, frailty is a state of being at increased risk, and you have decreased reserves or ability to tolerate stresses. It's common in older individuals, but it's not universal. It's estimated that about 1 in 10 of individuals 50 and over will be frail. About 5 out of 10 will be, let's say, at risk for frailty. Um, Women tend to be frail more than men. So when you're frail, your body doesn't have the ability to cope with stresses as well as it would when you were healthy. Um, and minor stresses can lead to significant problems for you.
What are some of the early warning signs that someone might be becoming frail?
Well, there are a lot of different ways of looking at frailty. Probably the most common um, way of trying to detect frailty is looking for five features. And if you have three or more of the features, then you're likely frail. So the features are unintentionally losing weight, say 10 pounds over the last year or more. Feeling tired, having little energy would be a second one. Being weak, and that's often measured by things like your grip strength, would be a third feature. Walking slowly. And the last one is having low levels of physical activity. You just don't get around or do as much as you did before or as most people would do.
I've got a number of questions about all of those, but I want to go back to first of all, why do we know why women are more likely?
Not clear. It may be that, women don't have as much, let's say, muscle mass as men. So when you look at things like maybe grip strength and walking speed, that might have some bearing. But when you're trying to detect if it's normal or abnormal, you always try to consider the person's sex and gender. Maybe that's one feature. Another possibility is that women tolerate um, adversity better than men. So, men who develop frailty, significant degrees of frailty, are more likely, unfortunately, to pass on. And maybe because women survive with frailty longer than men, you end up with a greater count of women with frailty compared to men.
And you had mentioned the weak weakness. Can some
Mhm.
of that be corrected just by doing weights? Like we always talk about how important it is as we get older to do strength building. Can some of that be corrected?
Yes, yes. And I mean, frailty tends to progress, but it's not universally progressive. And as I mentioned before, it doesn't occur in all older individuals. So physical activity, exercise is really important. Yes, you can reverse, some of the features of frailty by an individualized exercise program or activity program.
Is it ever too late?
Um, at a certain point, maybe, but I'd hate to kind of draw that line for people. I think if you're wondering about frailty and your ability to tolerate, for example, exercise and increase in physical activity, you should talk it over with your healthcare practitioner, your physician. Um, but clearly there does get a point where it might become too difficult. If you're particularly very prone to falls, for example, it might be hard to increase physical activity. Um, and also, if you have advanced stages of let's say dementia, you may not be able to embark upon an exercise program. But I wouldn't um, draw a line and say that beyond that point you shouldn't. I think it's something that might vary from person to person, and it's something you should talk over with your healthcare practitioner.
And is it something that can be measured by doctors, or is it more just a general observation? I know the weight thing you mentioned, that's something that can be actually measured, but what about the rest?
It can be. I mean, you can look at the speed of walking, so you can determine if someone has slow walking or slow gait speed. You can look at the grip strength, as I mentioned. You definitely can monitor weight, look for changes in weight. Um, the fatigue and the exhaustion, that's more subjective. You would have to ask someone for that. And low levels of physical activity that can be measured as well. There are scales to evaluate how active people are compared to their peers. So a lot of it can be measured, yes.
Can nutrition play a role in reversing or stopping this?
It can, and nutrition is more on the intervention side, but you want to ensure that you have a good intake of protein that's necessary for muscle. Um, you want to also ensure that you have good intake of foliage, get your folic acid, um, fruit, have a good balanced diet, not have a lot of fried foods, things of that nature would be important. Generally, for frailty, you'd like to follow a heart healthy diet, because what's good for the heart is probably good for the body and good for the brain as well.
Now, there's a newer term that people are hearing now, intrinsic capacity. Can you explain to people what exactly that means?
Sure, intrinsic capacity might be the flip side of the coin of frailty. And it really looks at the capacity and physical mental abilities that you can draw on any point in time. So it's generally broken down into kind of five areas that you either look at or assess. One is locomotion or mobility. Another one would be sensation. Generally, we focus on hearing and vision. A third would be thinking and cognition. The fourth would be psychological state, like, are you depressed, feeling hopeless? Can you deal with stress? And the last one is sort of a more difficult one to define precisely, and that's vitality. That's how much energy you have and how active you are, what your muscle strength is like. And that is kind of important for all, or at least a number of the ones I mentioned, obviously, initially. For example, if you're stronger, generally things like locomotion and mobility would be better. Um, so those are the five. So again, going over, so mobility, sensation, cognition, psychological state, and vitality. Those are things you look at. And it tends to look at your capacity. So it tends to be more optimistic than frailty, which really is a count of your deficits or problems. Um, and that's why it's often viewed as sort of the flip side of frailty. Um, and it's relatively new. The World Health Organization has been pushing this concept, um, and it can be evaluated by practitioners, healthcare practitioners. And if you have deficiencies in one or more of these areas, there are things you can do about it, and hopefully that would increase your capacity and decrease your likelihood of developing frailty.
So that kind of leads to my other question. Why are experts shifting the conversation more from treating disease to looking at intrinsic capacity?
Well, I think in healthcare, there's a shift from trying to look at diseases and management and treatment of diseases to looking at healthy aging, and looking at our everyday function and what we can do for ourselves, um, and what we can do to maintain our independence. So it's sort of extending the lens from just looking at diseases and deficits to kind of looking holistically at capabilities as well.
Is there of those ones you mentioned the mobility, the cognition, see if I can
Hmm.
remember them now, vision, hearing, psychological, and that vitality. Is there any of those that stand out in your mind as being more important than others?
Well, probably vitality would be the most important one, but the vitality is the one that's a little bit harder to conceptualize and define precisely, because it underpins things like mobility that I mentioned. And also, vitality would have an impact on your psychological state and possibly your cognition. Maybe less so on sensation, but they're all kind of interrelated. Um, it's it's um it's 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 possible when you look at a picture of someone's intrinsic capacity to kind of develop an individualized plan for them to maximize it, to kind of try to focus on things where they might be having problems and also looking at issues like lifestyle, like smoking, as you know, is never good. Drinking excessively is not good. Physical activity, as I mentioned before, is really important. But things like, stress and how you deal with stress, getting your sleep, that's really important. Trying to minimize loneliness and isolation, all those things are vitally important. Um, and it's still very important to still look at your health state and diseases and whether they're being managed well, and look at your medications because medications are a great help at times, but excessive intake of medications can lead to side effects and interactions. So, periodically your medication should be reviewed with your healthcare practitioner and see if you still have to be on the same regimen or possibly things could be cut or decreased or changed.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I had a doctor on here recently talking about polypharmacy and that the importance of reviewing them to make sure we don't aren't on things needlessly.
Yep.
Um, and the one thing I like about the intrinsic capacity is that it includes things that aren't, and correct me if I'm wrong, the other list, the frailty list, is more just physical things like
That's
losing
right.
weight and being tired and weak grip, whereas the intrinsic capacity includes more things like that would lead that benefits you would get from socializing, like say your vitality and your psychological well-being.
Yeah, that's right. I should mention there are different ways of looking at frailty, and there's one also popular way of looking at frailty where you just count up the person's deficits or problems and get kind of a ratio of these deficits, compared to all the things you consider, where you could include more psychological components and social components. But um, frailty, even though people talk a lot about it, it's a little bit hard to sometimes precisely define. That one of the issues I have with frailty is a point you bring up, that it focuses, on deficits and it's kind of limited to more the physical side. Um, where I think with healthy aging, we have to be more holistic and look at, psychological attributes, that you might miss with a pure perspective looking at physical frailty. Um, and also there's attributes and strengths you bring to that balance that might be missed by looking just at deficits, like your ability to deal with stress, your
Mm,
optimism, how well connected you are, your relationships,
right.
all those things would be strengths.
Now, at what age should people start thinking about maintaining their intrinsic capacity, or is it just completely up to the individual?
I think you like to start early rather than late. Um, I think intrinsic capacity is something you can consider at any age, but probably from about 50 and on, it might become more of a focus. Um, and you might want to, for example, embark upon a physical activity exercise program, um, and get that into your lifestyle and part of your habits of living. Um, and that might be beneficial. It's important to consider your diet at any age, but maybe particularly so once we hit 50 and above.
What advice would you have for then someone in their 50s and 60s to help ensure that they stayed independent, say into their 80s?
I think I would look at questioning about like how mobile I am and make sure if I have sensory problems with hearing, vision, try to have them corrected. Like how mobile you are. It could be evaluated simply by how often you can stand from sitting, how long it takes you to do it 5 times from a standard chair. And you should be able to do that within 14 seconds. So if you're taking longer, that suggests maybe you're not, st as strong, at least in your lower extremities, as you should be, maybe not as active as you should be. That would be a bit of a spur to do more. For cognition, just think about your own memory, your own concentration. Do you think is declining? And it could be tested by asking people to recall maybe 3 items over a couple minutes or their orientation to time and place. Psychological, do you feel depressed? Do you feel particularly anxious? You're hopeless? You're not interested in things? Those would be important questions to ask yourself. And vitality, just how active you are. And do you feel tired? Do you feel that everything takes an effort? That would suggest maybe you have problems with vitality, and maybe if increasing your physical activity, your exercise will gradually improve that over time.
I'd like to go back to that one thing where you said about getting up from the couch. I'd seen this post on social media. It talked about the importance of being able to get up without using your
Arms.
hands. Is there some truth to that we should be
Yes.
practicing that?
Well, it's you can use it as a test. You can also use it as an exercise, like getting up repeatedly from a sitting position. But as a test, yes, there's truth to it. And also, you could have problems in getting up and, from sitting and standing and getting down and standing, because of problems with your balance as well. It's not just purely a strength test. So it is a test of locomotion. So it could be used. It also could be used to look at fatigue and what your endurance might be like. For example, there are standardized tests where you're asked to step highly and you count how many times a person can step highly over, let's say, 2 minute span, and that will give you an idea about their endurance and whether fatigue might be a problem for them.
And when it comes to adult children,
Mhm.
what should they be watching for in their aging parents, and how do they have a conversation about something like this?
Well, I think all the things we talked about already could be evaluated, observed, considered. What I think is really important is that children should shift from doing for to assisting with when they're dealing with their parents. And you have to respect your parent. You have to understand, their lifestyle, their pattern of life, their values, their beliefs, um, and what their objectives are. For example, you might be particularly concerned that they're at risk for falls. But for them to stay independently mobile, they're willing to, deal with that risk and accept it. Well, you might be overprotective, and that might lead to even a worse state of health and poorer quality of life for them. Um, and so you have to kind of agree on what the objectives are. I think it's also important to give choices rather than direction. Um, and be patient. Sometimes people take a while to come around to your way of thinking, even when you're correct. Um, and you can also, make things a little bit easier in the environment for them. Um, and that might be more acceptable. You can look at hazards around the house if you're worried about falls. Um, if people have problems with grip strength, you could switch from doorknobs to levers for the doorway to open and close doors. You can also look at smart technology. You can get, fall detection on your smartphone. Um, you can also look at emergency response systems that people can wear if you're worried about them living on their own and they have some health issues. Um, so there are a lot of things you can do maybe to make the environment safer for them and also might enable greater independence, for them.
Those are some great tips, and I really like what you bring up, the balance between risk and quality of life. I would like to definitely explore that one at length in another time.
That that
And
yeah, I'm just going to say that would take a whole session and
yes,
yeah.
it's a fascinating one. And for seniors watching this who may already feel like they're slowing down, is there a message of hope that you ha might have for them?
Yes, yeah, I think definitely it's not irreversible. For many people, it can be reversed, or as a minimum maintaining your current capabilities. So I think if you have questions, talk it over with your healthcare practitioner and go from there.